Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Philosophy Night. This month we're discussing a book by Anthony Esolen called Nostalgia, Going Home in a Homeless World. Now, it's going to be difficult to cover everything covered in the book, and actually as I prepared the handout for you, I usually like to kind of do a short summary of each chapter. But in this case, I spent a lot of time on the introduction because it introduced so many good things and that were important. And so following up on that, I tried to just carry forward a couple of streams of thought. And then we skip to the end of the book after just a couple of chapters. But my hope is that you will want to read this book because it is well worth the read. Thoroughly enjoyed reading it. So in a way, this is sort of like a book review and a book summary at the same time. Well, let's begin with a prayer then. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, our Mother. To thee do we come, before thee we stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer us. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Well, the book starts out with a mysterious man, and maybe as the narrative continues, you will figure out who he is talking about. He doesn't tell us right away who he's talking about. But sooner or later, he identifies the subject, the character. So we begin, the very beginning of the book, with an introduction, starts like this. The man is sitting on the shore, looking out upon the sea, his arms about his knees. That's what he has done for a long time now, longer than he can remember. He sheds a tear. Is it a countryside he longs for? What is special about that place? What makes his heart yearn to see it again? You can't do much with thoroughbred horses there because the terrain is too rocky. It isn't a center of commerce where you might meet many strangers traveling to and fro. It's good for wheat and raising pigs. Would it not be easier to give up hope, to stay here on this island and let things go as they must go far away? The goddess is good, and she has promised him much more than her loyalty. He will not age so long as he remains with her. Perpetual youth, utter security, on a beautiful island with a goddess who loves him as you love a pet. Plenty of good food, wine, and peace. And the narrative continues. A flutter of wings and spray, the kingfisher with a fish in its beak. All is well except with the man. He suffers a pang of something bitter and sweet, and more bitter than sweet. Yet he does not wish that the feeling would go away. He cherishes it. It is in his language the algeia for the noston, pain for the return, ache for the homecoming. The Welsh call it hiraeth. I don't know Welsh, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Welsh call it hiraeth, longing. And in one of their folk songs, they say that nobody can tell what exactly hiraeth is, but it brings both great joy and intense pain. In German, it is Heimweh. Is that right? How do you say that in German? Stephen, how do you say that in German? Heimweh. Heimweh? Okay. Which means home woe, or Sehnsucht, seeking to see again. In English, it's homesickness. In Italian, you feel mancanza di casa, that is, you are missing the home, literally the house. It is like a hole in your heart. The Italians express it by the Greek word that has entered English and is the subject of this book, nostalgia, the ache to turn back home. Has anyone guessed who that character is that he's referring to? Anyone? Yes? Well, of course, if you look to the next sentence, you'll see who it is. Subheading, hatred of the present. Before I returned to Odysseus on the shore, I want to spell out what this book is not. It is not a book of misty-eyed adulation of imagined time that never existed, or of a past that is not ours, and that we half invent less out of love for anything real than out of hatred of what is. Is it not nostalgia as despair? Or it is not nostalgia as despair. So in other words, I saw a definition of nostalgia just on the internet, and it said sentimental feelings of going back to something. And that isn't the way we're really talking. It's not exactly the way we're talking about it here. It's not exactly the way we're talking about it here. And as he says, this book is not a misty-eyed adulation of imagined time that never existed, or of a past that is not ours, and that we half invent, less out of love for anything real than out of hatred for what is. So we often see sentimental things portrayed of an idyllic time that really wasn't that way. There's no golden age, there's no perfect time in history, because humanity is what it is. And wherever you have human beings, there is sin and all the things that go along with it. So there's no perfect time in history, even though we might look back on our own lives and long for something that has passed. And that's the nostalgia we're talking about, something that is actual, something that is real, and something that we love. Now, John Henry Newman warned against wishing that you were born in another time or place, because the providence of God has willed us to be here, now. These are the neighbors we are to love as ourselves. This is the land which we honor as we honor our mother and father. And these are the times that try our souls. That does not mean that we accept everything that happens about us. Newman certainly did not, nor does it mean that we ignore the wisdom of the past. Newman did not do that either. The history of man is a long tale of misery from which we learn nothing, except, perhaps, how to avoid doing what people used to do. Only the future, which no one can know, is real to him. For the sake of that idol, all manner of evil and folly can be justified, and in the terrible wars of the 20th century has been justified. And C.S. Lewis's shrewd demon Uncle Screwtape reveals the general principle. This is from Screwtape. The future is of all things the least like eternity. It is the most completely temporal part of time, for the past is frozen and no longer flows. And the present is all lit up with its eternal rays. Hence the encouragement we have given to all those schemes of thought such as creative evolution, scientific humanism, or communism, which fix men's attention on the future, on the very core of temporality. Hence, nearly all vices are rooted in the future. Gratitude looks to the past, and love to the present. And fear, avarice, lust, and ambition look ahead. That's an interesting comment there. The future is of all things the least like eternity, because it's uncertain, and the future is always in the future. So it is. There's nothing. We're not there now. Whatever the present is, the present seems like it's eternal because it's always passing, but it's always present. We're always right now, but right now is no longer right now, except that right now is. And so there is this sense of the eternal in the present, but the future is a time that has not yet happened. And so that's where we have this sense of time, of temporality. Well, let's continue. Men are seldom as bad as the worst of their ideas. Witness the common and continual and changeless call for change, for the sake of change, and the contempt for people who dare to ask whether a particular change is actually for the good. What can change without a subject or an object possibly mean? Does a man who loves his wife want to change her from year to year? No, because what we love, we want to endure. So one of the themes that we'll see in this book is this idea of nostalgia, which is a longing for home, and this sense of eternity that is attached to nostalgia. And then we have this other theme of progress or a hatred for home, a hatred for nostalgia, and a desire for change. And so that's focused on the future, as it's focused on a future in time rather than the present, which is like eternity, or eternity itself, or also the past, for which we are grateful, we give thanks. That's a main theme that we'll see within this discussion then. So, what we love, we want to endure. No man ever said, I used to play ball on a field that was here. I think it was here. There was a stream at its far end, and a ball hit into it on the fly was a home run. I can't imagine where any stream would be now, but I am glad indeed that it no longer exists. I am glad that there's a tangle of highways here. I am glad that the slender blade of grass is now a mile broad clover leaf. Freeway, that is. That's progress. Now, the author is saying, no man ever said that. Maybe someone has. Even if he understands that the highway had to be built, he's not glad of the loss. I've never met a single person who was happy that the school he attended, the church where he worshiped, or the old house where he grew up is now dust. It is natural for man to long for home. It is not natural for him to knock out its posts and feed its beams to termites. So we can look back on this property here where the church was, and we can remember that there used to be a convent on the other side of that wall. There was a convent where the garden is. And the old rectory, the rectory wasn't there, and the rectory was that big house across the street. And the big church wasn't there, because this was the church. This was the parish hall and the school and the church. We can look back, even though we don't remember that ourselves, but we know that that's what was once here. And we see that it was necessary to build a new church. But in a way, it's unfortunate that what was once here, a 3-story building, with 90 students enrolled in 1908 up on the 3rd floor, or up on the 2nd floor, daily mass Sunday Mass on the 3rd floor, and this parish gatherings right here where we are today. It's kind of a shame that it's no longer here, but it burnt. There were 2 fires. That's a shame. We aren't happy that there were fires. We don't revel in the idea that those fires burnt this building and we're happy of it because that's progress. And you can think about your own childhood home. Maybe you miss that home you grew up in. Maybe your parents still live there, or maybe your parents have passed away. Maybe your family moved at some point, and you think back about that home where you were a child. Maybe that home is no longer there. That's a sad thing. We shouldn't be happy about that, but we could see that it's necessary, that such a thing could happen. But why does Odysseus want to go home? Odysseus wants to go home because it is his home. It is as simple as that. But we should not let that simplicity deceive us. We must not be reductive. We cannot say that Odysseus will be happy when he has come home. He may be happy. He may not. But happiness is not the point. It is the duty of a man to fight for his own. Even when the enemy has overrun it like locusts, it is also his duty to love that home and to want to protect it. And if it has been reduced to rubble, it is his duty to build it up again. And in doing so, he does not pretend that it was perfect. It was not perfect. I will speak in its place about the heaven toward which we turn our gaze. But the reason we love our home is because it simply is. So he speaks about in its place, in the place of the home is heaven toward which we turn our gaze. So that's That's a key to this idea of nostalgia, about wanting to be home. That heaven is our home, and our house, or our home where we live, is like an allegory for heaven. Okay. Well, we continue then. Now we look at the virtue of piety. So what is piety? Piety is the love of parents for their children, and piety is the love for children for their parents. And when we look at piety as something related to God, it is God's love for us, but it's also our love for God. So piety inspires us to be pious. In other words, if we are, prayerful and reverent in the church, it's because we love God. It's not because we want to prove anything to anyone else. We don't want others to see us and say, oh, that person is very pious. Just look at that person and how pious they are. There should be, we needn't be self-conscious about people noticing our piety, but neither should we be trying to prove our piety other than proving it to God, that we do it out of love. Well, let's look at how this applies to our topic tonight. The virtue of piety. It is also natural for man to look to his elders for wisdom. They are the builders of his moral home. And you will find this sense of reverence for the old in every culture in the world. Now, this is another theme that we're going to see revisited. Every culture in the world. There is a sense of reverence for the old in every culture in the world. Not just in some cultures, but in every culture. This piety is at once a deeply personal virtue and a powerful force to bring together the generations, allowing the young to take root in the soil of the old, to engraft their experiences onto the young, so that we sense that home is a place where the passing day partakes of long ages past and to come. So the ages that are to come are a continuation of the past and the present. So we're not talking about that future time as Screwtape was speaking of it, but that the past informs the present and continues into the time to come. So there's a continuity there. Now you might be reading this or listening to this and thinking, well, life isn't like that. People aren't like that now. The young don't want anything to do with the old. They cast off, they don't listen to the old. They don't want to hear the stories. They don't want to stick around. They want to move away, and they want to start something new. Well, let's continue. Honor thy father and thy mother, says the commandment, the one that forms a bridge between our duty to God and our duty to others. It is the only commandment with a promise. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Nothing here of the puerile dismissal of the father, characteristic of our time, of spoiled, unhappy, and aimless children, old in years and infantile in wisdom. Central to a healthy attitude of reverence is an insight that the self-named progressive is ever in danger of missing, which is that man can no more discover a new moral truth than he can invent a new color of the spectrum. What we can do instead is to develop a moral insight already grasped, or we allow a moral insight to lapse into forgetfulness or confusion, or we are fitful and foolish in our application of the insight. And here the conservative needs to be careful, lest he conserve the outward trappings and lose the soul. But the truths do not change. Okay, so now the progressive then is being identified as the one who is not nostalgic, who despises the past, who will not honor mother and father, and is seeking for change, even just for the sake of change. But the conservative needs to be careful. lest he conserve the outward trappings and lose the soul. And so what we sometimes find is that the conservatives are pointed out and called hypocrites because they might look good or they might look like they're doing the good things, but they've lost their soul, so they aren't doing it for the right reason. And oftentimes today, we know in politics, the conservatives and the liberals actually are all in cahoots. They aren't so different as you might think. So we're not talking about necessarily conservative, that conservatism is, that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. But we'll get to that in time. So now that's the introduction. That pretty much introduces to us the themes that we'll explore now through the rest of the book. All right, so now there's two chapters that I thought were especially good. The first chapter is called Man in Time, and the second chapter is Man in Place. But we won't speak about the second chapter, because we just don't have time. But we will talk about Man in Time, and wonderful thoughts in this chapter. We start with a sonnet number 12 from William Shakespeare. When I do count the clock that tells the time, and see the brave day sunk in hideous night, when I behold the violet past prime, and sable curls all silvered o'er with white, when lofty trees I see barren of leaves, which erst from heat did canopy the herd, and summer's green all girded up in sheaves, borne on the bier with white and bristly beard, then of thy beauty do I question make, that thou among the wastes of time must go, since sweets and beauties do themselves forsake and die as fast as they see others grow. And nothing gainst time's scythe can make defense, save breed to brave him when he takes thee hence. Now consider the above sonnet by Shakespeare. In his day, a collection of sonnets was not a grab bag of love poems tossed in at random. It was a highly organized and intricate work of art, and each sonnet was a piece of the whole. Shakespeare has thus begun his sequence of sonnets with 17 poems that all have to do with one way, the most obvious way to defeat the fell purposes of time. You have children. So the narrator of the sonnets, whom we should not naively identify with the poet himself, begins by telling the young man whom he addresses that he had better get married soon and have children, because time that delves the parallels in beauty's brow will be doing its inevitable work. As spring passes into summer and summer into fall, and the sheaves are brought in on a bier like the body of an old man with a white beard brought to the burial ground, so must we too pass away. And the urgency here is not for the human race, but for the individual person. Again, Shakespeare puts it brilliantly, striking home to the point where childhood greets old age and makes a man feel young again. So says King Polyxenus about his 9-year-old son. From the Winter's Tale. If at home, sir, he's all my exercise, my mirth, my matter, now my sworn friend, and now mine enemy, my parasite, my soldier, statesman, all. He makes a July's day short as December, and with his varying childness cures in me thoughts that would thick my blood. Now, by thickening his blood, we're not talking merely about boosting the old man's metabolism, as he's speaking about how the varying childness in his son cures him. He has thoughts that would thicken his blood, and these thoughts in our quiet moods, in our old age, must be of the passing of time, the loss of loved ones, the things we have done that we cannot undo, the things we should have done that we have left undone, and death. Those 5 things. The passing of time, the loss of loved ones, the things we have done that we cannot undo, the things we should have done that we have left undone, and death. Now, no other creature upon earth experiences anything remotely resembling these thoughts. We are immersed in time, as all things are, but we alone can grasp it as it passes. We can stand above it or beside it. We alone are conscious of age and death. We alone can sin and know that we have sinned. We alone can mourn our lost innocence. It is not then survival that we ask from our children, but hope. So no animal can reflect on, being sorry for last week, the puppy that's being paper trained. That puppy can't look back on last week and feel sorry. And that puppy is not aware even that he is a puppy. He has no idea how little he is or how big he may one day be. And he doesn't know how old he is. And he doesn't even think about death. He's a puppy. Now you could say, well, a baby doesn't think about those things either. But the puppy will grow into a dog who still can't think of those things, whereas the baby will grow into a man or a woman who can reflect upon those things. Now, so children are a source of our hope. Children are a reminder of youthfulness, and that youthfulness that is in all of our hearts as we get older. Also, the children give a sense of immortality, the passing on of the generations. But there's another way that a person remains alive, and so we hear that from the youthful John Milton writing on Shakespeare about 15 years after Shakespeare's death. What needs my Shakespeare for his honored bones, the labor of an age in piled stones, or that his hallowed relics should be hid under a star-y-pointed pyramid? Dear son of memory, great heir of fame, what needest thou such weak witness of thy name? Thou, in our wonder and astonishment, hast built thyself a livelong monument, for whilst to the shame of slow endeavoring art thy easy numbers flow, and that each heart hath from thine leaves of thy unvalued book those Delphic lines with deep impression took, then thou, our fancy of itself bereaving, dost make us marvel by too much conceiving, and so sepulchred in such pomp dost lie, that kings for such a tomb would wish to die. And we have a little bit of interpretation of that now from Esolen. Shakespeare says Milton needs no pile of slave-dredged bricks to build himself a pyramid pointing to the stars, such as the pharaohs of old Egypt had, and such as Horace boasted to have erected for himself. He has a finer monument than that, a live-long monument, one that is alive and always shall be. Now, Milton is not saying in a sentimental way that Shakespeare will live on in his work. The very spirit of Shakespeare, what he thought and felt, what he saw of the truth, and what he imparted of that truth in power and beauty, seizes the souls of his readers. And we who read Shakespeare and are stunned by his genius, we are the sepulchres, alive, in which not we but the poet speaks. And so you can consider then that the actor or the reader disappears, and the voice of Shakespeare, or the character that Shakespeare has conceived and written into the play, that character or that spirit of Shakespeare then is alive, and you could say more alive than the actor who will pass away, who is portraying the character or reading the lines of the sonnet. Now, in a greater way, we say that sacramentally, Christ is the priest, and any man who stands in his place is passing away, but the priesthood is eternal, and the Mass is eternal. The sacraments will end at the end of this world. But even so, There is this sense of eternity in the Mass, that we are looking upon something outside of time and place. So in a similar way, analogously, we're looking at Shakespeare's work in this way. And from a philosophical point of view, there is this sense of immortality in the works of an artist, whether it be a painter or a sculptor or a writer, or there's a sense that men of past ages have left monuments, whether it's pyramids or palaces or the Woolworth Tower or Rockefeller Center in New York City or something to that effect, or the great churches of old. Of course, the great churches of old generally are anonymous. We have no idea who built them, other than the more modern ones. Now, T.S. Eliot would agree with a stern proviso: without tradition, it cannot be. When tradition is scorned, when the love of home has vanished, when man has neither the longing for home nor its brother longing, the spirit of the pilgrim, Milton's words make no sense. We are the walking dead. We do not grow but shrink into obsolescence and oblivion. We are here in the realm of culture. So culture is the realm where everything continues, where the past becomes the present and continues into the future. Whereas those who would spurn the past, spurn tradition, who would disrespect their mother and their father, are the walking dead, because they are without, they're without a home. They're without an identity. They're without a past, and their future is the product of vice. So now we're going to speak about culture. And this is another one of those themes that is really wonderful in this work. So culture against decay. In other words, if there is no culture, then there is decay. Now, by culture, I do not mean what people with a lot of money do, going to La Scala to hear Rossini and then boasting about it at a luncheon the next day. I do not mean culture as a commodity or as a sign of social prestige. I certainly do not imply what has happened to high culture in our time in the so-called Regie Theater of the opera, turning works of tremendous power into crass political statements laced with the profane and the obscene. Okay, now let me give you a definition of Regie Theater, and you've probably experienced this. This is from Wikipedia. Regie Theater is the modern practice of allowing a director freedom in devising the way a given opera or play is staged so that the creator's original specific intentions or stage directions can be changed, together with major elements of geographical location, chronological situation, casting, and plot. Typically, such changes may be made to point a particular political point or modern parallels which may be remote from traditional interpretations. Examples found in Regie Theater productions may include some or all of the following. 1. Relocating the story from the original location to a more modern period. Secondly, modifications to the story from the original script. And thirdly, interpretive elements stressing the role of race, gender, class-based oppression are emphasized. Now, one famous example of this is West Side Story. West Side Story is a musical that came out in the mid-1950s and was an updating of Romeo and Juliet, except that it was not placed in Italy. It was placed in New York City, and it was two fighting street gangs, the Puerto Ricans and the Polacks, the Polish. And this was to stress the role of race and gender and class-based oppression, modifying the story from the original script. Now, West Side Story is a very, entertaining production. The music is great, and it's one of those very successful works. And it doesn't call itself Romeo and Juliet. It is another story, but it's based on that story. But if you go to a Shakespeare festival and you expect that you're going to see Macbeth, or you expect that you're going to see, any of these great plays, and then you find out that they changed the setting and the time and the characters and the plot for these reasons, that can be pretty annoying. You just paid good money for that ticket. Maybe you traveled to see that play. And what is this that you came to see? This isn't Romeo and Juliet. This isn't Macbeth. This isn't Troilus and Cressida, or whichever production you're watching. But that is what happens when we have a disrespect for the tradition. Now, there's artistic creativity and all of that. But there is a greater place for the tradition. And when you change a play like that, you lose the spirit of Shakespeare. So that spirit of Shakespeare that we're talking about here, that lives on and breathes through that play and through the characters and the script and such, you lose that. And what you gain instead is you gain what the director did, or what the new scriptwriters did, or the actors improvised, or whatever. All right, let's continue. The word culture then suggests the inner reality. It is culture because a farmer, agricola in Latin, has tilled, cultivare, the soil. So culture is to cultivate the soil. Not with a machine for raising everything in sight. The true tiller of the soil has nothing in common with Mao. You must be careful of the soil, and the seeds you plant now may come to full fruit long after you have passed away. A man gathers the apples from a tree planted by his grandfather, and grafts into hardy stalk a slip of a peach tree in the hope, not the optimism, that his children and his children's children will reap the rewards. There's a big difference there between the hope and mere optimism. Hope is looking forward to the future when a man knows that this graft of a peach tree is going to bear fruit for his grandchildren and great-grandchildren and future generations. And he has no doubt of that. That's hope. But optimism is planting it just in case they might decide to stick around, but they probably won't. But he just hopes that they do. And that's not hope. That's optimism. And I think that's what many people fall into now, because they know that their grandchildren aren't going to be around, if they have grandchildren at all. We know of no human society. Okay, now we're looking again here at how every culture has certain things in common. We know of no human society except perhaps our own without culture so defined. Every people we know of, except perhaps ourselves, has sung the songs its fathers and mothers sang, and celebrated the holy days, and prayed the prayers, and prepared the food, and carved the shillelaghs, and done the 1,000 other things that are the more precious to a people, because it knows in its heart, its mind, and its very fingers that they have been done just so and will continue to be done. Man without culture is an inert thing, acted upon by the psychological manipulators of mass education, mass politics, mass marketing, mass entertainment. It makes no difference that those in apparent control of these mass phenomena are themselves carried along by their swell and flow. If anything, it makes matters worse, and he refers here to George Orwell's 1984. The linguist in 1984, Syme, knew all about the ideological aim of Newspeak and explained it to Winston Smith with the chilling enthusiasm of a destroyer. And a few weeks later, Syme was no longer to be seen because evil eats its own. Any thoughts, any comments before we continue? Okay. Subheading, it is not good for the man to be alone. I have said that culture is one of the means by which man makes his dwelling in time and beyond time, and that it therefore requires generosity and gratitude. I must accept with thanks what I have been given and preserve all that is good in it, which will be great indeed, and seek to measure my works by its high standard and pass it on to my children with love. On the other hand, we have the iconoclast, the icon smasher, is not generally a lover of mankind. And here let me add something that is hard to see when we are thinking only of selves and their survival. It is that the longing to go home to a real culture is also a longing not to be alone anymore. They who are cut adrift in time are like survivors of a shipwreck, each clinging to his own spar or beam. But they who are at home, in culture, dwell in something that spans the generations and renews them, throwing bridges across the divides of class and sex and age. Think of a black man and a white man who both love the poetry of John Keats, and what a profoundly beautiful thing they share in the depths of the souls. At the best of times, the rich man and the poor man do not share enough. In our time, the rich man and the other rich man share almost nothing. I will relate a personal story. I remember, many years ago, I was in this group. And in the group, there were people of various races and ages and ideologies. And it struck me that the two white men in the room, me and another one, had nothing whatsoever in common. We had nothing in common. We didn't think alike. We came to completely different conclusions on things. We were really of different cultures. And yet I had the most in common with the people of other races and ages because we shared the same culture. We came from the same culture. And I remember when I went to Mexico as a deacon for Spanish immersion, that I was in classes. I was in one class. I was the only Catholic. I was a deacon at the time. And the rest of the class was filled with Protestant ministers who were there, learning Spanish so they could basically convert Catholics into Protestants. And the teacher was telling us about Mexican culture and had this calendar of the year and was talking about, Epiphany and Candlemas and All Souls Day and all of these things. And the Protestant ministers were just marveling at this beautiful Mexican culture. And I said, well, this isn't Mexican culture. This is just Catholic culture. This is the culture I grew up with. But you see, I had nothing in common with the other people from the United States who were in that classroom. For that very reason, that my culture was Catholic, as was the Mexican culture that we were learning about. It was the same culture. But the culture of people who live maybe in my same neighborhood in the United States, and people would think, oh, well, you're all white, you're the same. We were so different. We couldn't have had a conversation, really, about much. So we're speaking about now culture. In our time, the rich man and the other rich man share almost nothing. Now, when Jesus and his apostles ate the Passover supper on the night before he died, they said the prayers their forefathers had said and sang the songs. And so when Jesus himself commanded remembrance of that moment, he was doing far more than asking the apostles to think of him when they were in their cups. He was instituting a new rite of remembrance, a new reenactment of the liberating Magnalia Dei, those past and that which was soon to come. His sacrificial death upon the cross as the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. And that is why St. Paul insists upon a faithful tradition, a handing on from one believer to the next, from one generation to the next, of what Jesus did before his own blood would be splattered on the posts and lintels of a world in bondage to sin and death. And St. Paul speaks, or writes, "For I have received of the Lord that which I also delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me.' After the same manner also he took the cup when he had supped, saying, 'This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye, as oft as ye drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, ye do show the Lord's death till he come.'" And that from the first epistle to the Corinthians. Now this is more than a habit or a custom. Dogs have habits. People have plenty of customs which are little more than commonplace ways of greeting someone or saying goodbye. And this is tradition. This is tradition in the strict sense, the bequeathing of a heritage. It is also more than that. It is a grasping of time past, time present, and the time to come, in communion with your fellow worshipers in the church where you are kneeling, and before all the altars of the world, at all times, so long as time shall be. Now, nothing in the experience of a secular man is like it. I state the obvious. When does secular man read and hear words spoken 2,000 years ago, not as curiosities, but as urgent revelations and warnings and commands and consolations, as still present, as if spoken to him and to his fellows face to face, words that interpret for him the whole journey of his life and the journey of the life of mankind from Adam to the men of the last day? Secular man, having lost the dimension of the eternal, must be swept along the rapids and eddies of time. He has no stay against them. He is lost in the cosmos, as Walker Percy says. He builds houses in time, but no home, either in eternity or in the here and now. And there we have the end of chapter 2. Now, we have the end of chapter 1, Man in Time. Now, Man in Place is also a very good chapter. And in that he speaks about, among other things, the importance of being where you are. The importance of being where you are, but also the importance of that place where you grew up. You know, the place is important. Even if it's not fancy, even if there's nothing special about it, but the very fact that you grew up there and that you can close your eyes and still walk those streets or those paths or along the pond or climbing the tree, and you remember all the little details because you were there. And it's special to you. And it's an important place. But now we pass on to chapter 3, called Lost Among the Ruins. Advertisements for the homeless. Oh, this is a good one. I once angered a number of students at the university where I taught by suggesting that multiculturalism is a sham. There is nothing multi about its uniform politics, I said, and it is too rootless and shallow to be a culture. And when I met with some of them, I showed them Millet's Angelus. This is a famous painting. You've probably seen it before. Okay. This is the painting called the Angelus. And you'll notice there's a little church in the background. They're working out in the field. They put down their things and they're praying. A man and a woman are praying. And it's clear from the title that they're praying the Angelus. And that is an example of culture. We know what they're doing. We see these things and we know what they're doing. And you could say that people all over the world, like us, of various races and ages and sexes, could look at this and know exactly what's happening. And it's just so obvious because it's deeply rooted in our culture. So when I met with some of them, I showed them Millet's Angelus, the painting of the man and the woman in the field, and they grew uneasy. They did not want to concede that what we were looking at was essentially cultural. And that was because they knew in their hearts that what I said about contemporary man is true. He has no home. Now, one of them complained that I was imposing my view of culture upon them, but he had no reply when I said that my description fits every known culture until, for want of a more accurate term, we call our own. Every known culture. Still another, a native speaker of English but of Hispanic ethnicity, grew petulant and said that if she had no culture, it was because others, Europeans, had robbed her and her people of it. But none had any response to the point at hand, which was that the purported robbers, or the descendants of the robbers, the descendants of Europeans on our campus, had no culture either, no home. Well, those students in my office had youth's natural desire to fight, but they had nothing clear for which to fight, no clear object of devotion, so their fight was endued with bitterness and madness. I might have offended them worse had I suggested that there was a home for them, if they would rise up from the unsatisfying task of feeding husks to political swine. Let me present that home. In the decades following the Civil War, Helen Hunt Jackson, a friend of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and a liberal at a time when liberal did not imply a complete political program to banish all liberty from human life, except for the sexual, she went west to examine the plight of other peoples whom the United States government had treated badly. Now, in case you don't know, Harriet Beecher Stowe was a black woman, and this was after the period of during the time of the Civil War and after. So she went west to examine the plight of other peoples whom the United States government had treated badly, and these were the Indians. She began with the California missions, writing a series of long articles for several consecutive issues of the Century Illustrated magazine, in which she described the death of the great and indefatigable missionary, Father Junipero Serra. When the bell tolled his death, the people thronged the church, weeping and lamenting, and it was with great difficulty that the soldiers could keep them from tearing Father Juniper's habit piecemeal from his body, so ardent was their desire to possess some relic of him. Not without justification did the Indians want such memorials. He loved them and yearned over them as brands to be snatched from the burning. He had baptized over 1,000 of them with his own hands. His whole life he spent for them and was ready at any moment to lay it down for them if that would have benefited them more. Well, lest we think that Mrs. Jackson is indulging in prettiness, she is careful to present for us items from the friars' well-kept records regarding what was accomplished and produced at the missions in California, extending from San Diego to San Francisco. We must consider the wide variety of goods and trades the friars brought to the Indians, whose life in those dry lands had ever been marked by poverty, famine, and the threat of violence from stronger tribes. The Indians for the first time cultivated the vine and the olive. They planted orchards of apples, pomegranates, and oranges. They learned the arts of foundry and the mill. They dug wells, they raised cattle and sheep, they grew corn and traded the surplus for goods from abroad. They built schools, they learned to play musical instruments. And this is the quote from Mrs. Jackson. The picture of life in one of these missions during their period of prosperity is unique and attractive. The whole place was a hive of industry, trades plying indoors and outdoors, tillers, herders, vintagers by hundreds going to and fro, children in schools, women spinning, bands of young men playing on musical instruments, music the scores of which in many instances they had themselves written out. And at evening, all sorts of games of running, leaping, dancing, and ball throwing, and the picturesque ceremonies of a religion, which has always been wise in availing itself of beautiful agencies in color, form, and harmony. That's the end of her quote. So what happened to these homes? Well, governments happened to them. First the Mexican, ever levying goods and monies from these successful enterprises, and then after the Mexican War, the regional government of California, followed by the United States. The missions were sacked. Lands to which the Indians had a claim extending back 2 or 3 generations were sold to American speculators amid confusion as to the specifics of titles, sometimes justified confusion and sometimes bad faith. So all that the Franciscans did to elevate this community of people who had suffered famine and warring, threat of violence and poverty, and this prosperity that they had. The Franciscans didn't have the prosperity. It was the people who had the prosperity. All of that was taken away from them. And the missions were sacked. And now we have people wanting to topple statues of Junipero Serra and badmouth the missions. But it wasn't, the missions were not the enemies. The Franciscans were not the enemies. Well, the question we face is not what people in the past, who were on the whole no better or worse by nature than we are now, should have done. The question is what we are to do now and why. Where do we go? Well, people, there is such a thing as home. It is time to rise up and take a step in its direction. And that's the end of chapter 3. And now we're going to skip all the way to the end of the book to chapter 8, which is related. It is related to home. O grave, where is thy victory? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and he is still the center of all that turns in heaven and on earth. The pilgrimage is not an escape from, but a plunge into the fullness of life. For Christ rose not as a specter or a disembodied soul, but he rose in the flesh. The bodily resurrection was the single doctrine of Christianity least likely to recommend itself to the philosophers of the time, as Christ's assertion that his kingdom was not of this world was least likely to recommend itself to the Jewish patriots of the time. But upon that doctrine, upon man's adoration of the God who humbled himself to take on human flesh and exalted that flesh eternally, upon that is built all that in Christian culture and civilization is good and true and beautiful. Well, the pilgrim alone knows that his good and humble home perched on a hillside is an allegory of heaven, and not so by the arbitrary choice of the allegorist, but by its essence and our essence, as made by God who speaks to us through those essences. In the heart and mind of the pilgrim, everything is full to bursting with the dangerous and dashing bravura of the Maker. And the most common product in a world that has forgotten the pilgrimage, that worships a progress it defines in worldly terms, if it defines it at all, is garbage. Things made to become garbage and to be cast away as garbage. Old books are cast off because no one reads them because they're old. Old people are cast off because no one heeds them because they are old. Children who are not wanted, as if the most precious gift from the hand of God were nothing but scraps of costume jewelry, are cast off. History is bunk, as Henry Ford said. Garbage. Mountains of it. I have found books in our town's garbage station that should be in a library, and some of them used to be in the library until they were cast aside, unread, for garbage. Well, you just think about that. You know, everything we buy is just meant to to break or wear out in a couple of years. I've been reflecting on this with our cookware. How many sets of cookware have I bought since I got here 15 years ago? I think I'm on my third set, because you end up having to throw them away after 3 or 4 or 5 years. The dishwasher that was new 15 years ago when Father Boyle first got here is already having problems. We have to re-wash the dishes after they've gone through the wash cycle. And so on and so forth. Practically everything that's made today is meant to break. And so we do have mountains of garbage. Well, here's the paradox. They who long for heaven cherish the home. They who are on the way look with kindly favor and forgiveness upon the homely places along the way, where they have taken nourishment and lived and loved and suffered and died. They who adore progress and look for perfection on earth can at best tolerate those places. At worst, they despise them and want to clear them away because they speak of human folly, imperfection, and transience. Now that's a paradox, because you would think that those who are detached from the things of this world and longing for heaven would not have so much of an appreciation for their home, because it's passing away. And you would think that those who are not interested in the things of eternity, but only of the things of this world, would be more interested in the home and those things that they can hold on to that will last in this life. But it's actually, and that's the paradox, that it's not that way. Those who are interested in eternity have an appreciation for the places and the things of this world that have helped them along the way. And those who despise the thought of heaven or God or eternity also despise the things of this world. They wish to destroy and start over every new generation. They who worship progress pulverize. No place speaks to them, because there is no allegory and no holy God made manifest by the allegory. Their ears are clotted with the wax of the hour. Is it so surprising, then, that the sons of Saint Benedict would at once devote their lives to prayer and to make and love places where there had been but barrenness and wilderness before? The pilgrim understands the vow of stability. The restless wanderer hardly attains a place, but then he wants to leave it. And people are very transient today. People have a restlessness to leave, to move, to travel, to get away, go someplace new, start over fresh, leave the past behind. And now we have the subheading, Pilgrim Come Home. I return now to Odysseus. He has arrived in Ithaca, tested the intelligence and courage of his son and the loyalty of his wife. He slaughtered the 108 suitors who had been devouring his estate, cleansed the great hall with fire, and gone finally to reveal himself to his wife Penelope. Well, what will happen next? We do not know, nor does it matter. Odysseus, the man of many dodges, is home, and there is once again a real home for him and his family and their faithful servants to dwell in. Now, if we feel that there is something missing at the end of the Odyssey, it is because we are not ancient Greeks listening to the rhapsody as he sings the immemorial song. Our imaginations, whether we admit it or not, have been formed by the Scriptures and the Christian hope. It seems as if Odysseus has stopped short, and as if his home were less than the home for which we long. Well, part of that is because the home is a spiritual place, which we do not fit for our tastes. We must instead be made fit for it. I long on earth for a return to the way of life that is indeed a way. The trumpet sounds and the sleepers wake. Not one good thing we have known in this world will be lost, but all flesh will be transformed, says St. Paul, in the twinkling of an eye, the twinkle that is like a merry glint of love. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. So come, let us be done with the progress of death. Let us resume the pilgrimage. Now, isn't that interesting that our Lord says, "Behold, I make all things new." And yet, in that we recognize that it will be built upon the things of old that have come into the present and will continue. And there's this sense of eternity in that culture. So even though the Lord says he will make all things new, it will be familiar. It will be home. It will be where we belong. It won't be foreign to us. It won't be this altogether, innovation. It won't be an innovation. It will be a fulfillment.